very good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the ISAS panel discussion on Russia and the Indo-Pacific. Before we begin with the session, I would appreciate if you could mute your microphones and video throughout the session. If you have any questions or feedback to share with us, please forward them via the Zoom chat. We will consolidate your questions for the panelists to answer during Q&A time. This afternoon, we are delighted to have with us three distinguished panelists. First up is Mr. Christopher Cheang, Senior Fellow at Rajaratnam School of International Studies here in Singapore at Nanyang Technological University. Our second panelist is Dr. Alexei Zakharov, Research Fellow at Center for Indian Studies, Institute of Oriental Studies at the Russian Academy of Sciences. Our last panelist is Dr. Nivedita Kapoor, Junior Fellow at Strategic Studies Program, Observer Research Foundation at New Delhi. Chairing this session today will be Dr. Yogesh Joshi, Research Fellow here at Institute of South Asian Studies, NUS. I will now hand over the session to Dr. Yogesh. Dr. Yogesh, please start.
Thank you so much, Claudia, for making that initial introduction. And thank you so much for giving me an opportunity to kind of chair this very interesting session, a topic I'm extremely interested in, and for bringing in such an esteemed group of, scholars and policy discussants and analysts, in a sense, to kind of discuss Russia's role in the Indo-Pacific. And I think there are three major, arguments on which we should understand why it is significant to kind of delve deep into the role of Russia into the Indo-Pacific. I think the first of is the transitions of power, which are happening in international politics. And it is for the first time after almost 25, 30 years that countries like Russia are actually into a moment of bipolar politics, particularly confronting a great power in its immediate vicinity. Russia hasn't confronted a great power since the end of the Second World War in its immediate vicinity. So has India. So it's a very different, the bipolar contestation of international politics brings great challenges and great opportunities to both Russia and India, as well as ASEAN for that matter. The second thing is that these transitions of power are leading to new geopolitical alignments. You're increasingly looking towards Eurasian alignment with Russia, China, and Pakistan. And on the other hand, you're looking towards an Indo-Pacific realignment, geopolitical realignment in the form of the Quad. Even ASEAN kind of feels where its institutional centrality now exists in this larger dynamics of new geopolitical alignments. We don't know whether these geopolitical alignments are cast in stone, or this is much more about hedging or signaling what could be the possibilities for each of these individual states. But what it does is complicate, and this is the third point why we should kind of think about Russia's involvement in the Indo-Pacific, is that the past relationships are much more complicated, by the emerging future of foreign policies of these states, as the transition of power unfolds and new geopolitical alignments actually emerge. So India particularly is always very frustrated in terms of making a balance between pivoting to the US and kind of continuing with its traditional relationship with Russia. Russia, on the other hand, faces similar, dilemma vis-a-vis India and China. ASEAN similarly is now poised between economic interdependence with China and security relationship with the US, so to say. So, it's an interesting occasion to kind of understand where we are going in international politics. And I think Russia's involvement in the larger Indo-Pacific and contestation of power in the region is extremely important in how this unfolds. And that is where we think we should locate this panel today. Now, we have three exciting presentations. Mr. Christopher Cheang, who is a senior fellow at Rajaratnam School of International Studies, is going to focus on Russia's role in the Indo-Pacific, particularly its engagement with ASEAN. He has been a retired Singaporean diplomat and held different positions in Singapore and abroad before joining RSIS in October 2017. His overseas assignments were in Bonn, Moscow, and San Francisco. Dr. Alexei Zakharov, a colleague and a friend, is a research fellow at the Institute of Oriental Studies and Russian Academy of Sciences. Prior to this appointment, he was a visiting fellow at Observer Research Foundation, New Delhi, a visiting fellow at Manohar Parrikar Institute Defense Studies and Analysis, and visiting fellow at French Institute of Geopolitics at the University of Paris. Alexei is going to talk about Russia's evolving relationship in the South Asian region. And lastly, we have Dr. Nivedita Kapoor, who is a junior fellow at the Observer Research Foundation's Strategic Studies program. She tracks Russian foreign and domestic policy and Eurasian strategic affairs. She received a PhD from School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. And Nivedita is going to talk about how Russia situates itself in the larger transition of power in the region and the contestation, emerging contestation between US and China. Before I invite the participants, the panelists to kind of put forward their views, I would like you to mute your Zoom, and we will open for discussion after all the panelists have presented their initial comments. We will proceed as per the program, and I will now invite Mr. Christopher Cheang to give his initial comments. 10 to 15 minutes, Mr. Christopher. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Yogesh, if I may. First, I would like also to thank the organizer, body ISAS, for his invitation. Now, I have been asked to speak about Russia, Russia's role, importance, Russia's focus in Asia, Indo-Pacific, with a focus on ASEAN. I'm afraid I'm going to disappoint most, if not all of you, with my following presentation, but please bear with me. You can, of course, later during the question and answer, criticize me all you can, but this is my, I think, my very considered, frank and sincere view. I would like to add that having served in Russia for the better part of almost 15 years, I speak the Russian language, by the way, not as fluent as I would like, but I think I know the country. And I would just like to say, as a caveat, beginning, my presentation might sound critical, but it's quite sincere, and it's not meant actually to be an indictment on Russia's foreign policy. Now, let me just start with some facts. Russia has been a member of the ASEAN, the dialogue partners status, since 1996, according to my information. And he joined the ASEAN Regional Forum in 1995. Since then, both sides, ASEAN and Russia, have held a few summits. I shall not go into all of these because obviously this information can be found online and I do not have anything to add. Suffice to say that according to my research, trade between Russia and ASEAN grew between 2005 and the latest figures I have is 2019, from 500 million to 18.2 billion in 2019. So that's quite a jump, but still not that much. But anyway, that is a good start. Russia's investments in the ASEAN region have been focused on the energy sector. And also, Russia is a major weapons supplier to countries like Laos, Vietnam, and Myanmar. Now, having said that, this is my beginning of my presentation. I do not really believe that, at least in ASEAN, that Russia's role, at least as of today, has been that significant. This is not because Russia doesn't want to, or Russia cannot, or Russia is insincere. On the contrary, I think the diplomats, the Russian foreign ministry officials whom I worked with when I was there, they're all professionals. Not only professionals, but they are good professionals. So it is not for lack of trying or sincerity, but there are, I think, some factors which I shall outline now, why Russia's relations with ASEAN, and in fact, in this part of the world, the wider Asia-Pacific is not as significant as it could be or should be. Now, these are the reasons. They are not necessarily in order of importance, but I will go through them right now as fast as I can, because I think I have 8 minutes left. Now, firstly, the main factor which has inhibited a stronger, more active Russian presence in this part of the world is actually psychological. My interaction with Russians, and I'm talking about not only officials and academics, business people, the normal Russians, people I got to know there during my long years, is that they are quite European oriented in their worldview. And this, of course, starts at the top. The leaders, President Putin, he has been saying all these years, since he came to power at the end of 1989, but from the 2000s until recently, January this year, during the Davos Agenda 2021 online forum, he has been consistently talking about Russia's European roots. Russia is part of Western European culture. And this is what he said during that online forum in response to a question by Klaus Schwab, who, as you know, is the founder of the World Economic Forum. He said that Russia is basically geographically and most importantly, I quote, culturally, we are one civilization. He cited the late German Chancellor Helmut Kohl, who said that if we want, I quote, if we want European culture to survive and remain a center of world civilization in the future, then of course, Western Europe and Russia must be together. President Putin further argued, Russia and Europe are naturally, absolutely natural partners from the point of view of the economy, research, technology, spatial development of European culture, etc. So, as I may repeat myself, he has been saying this all these years, not every day, obviously, but quite often. I have been following his speeches many times. And this Eurocentric, and in fact, I would say even US-centric view of the world isn't limited to policymakers. I want to quote a young senior research fellow in the Institute, from the Institute for International Studies of GIMO. GIMO is a leading Russian institute of higher learning. His name is Alexei Zakharov, excuse me. He wrote an open letter in May last year to a generalized and unnamed American. This is an open letter. Now, of course, I'm not going to quote everything. I'm just going to quote what I think is relevant to the topic here. And let me quote. In this letter to this unnamed American, he says, let's not play the diplomat. We should openly admit that we don't just have our governments to blame. I mean, he was referring to the fact that US and Western Europe have problems with Russia. On the one hand, we are both Europeans. Our intellect owes a debt to Plato and Zeno, no less than to Tolstoy and Dreisner. You and I, he adds, have much more in common with each other than with a Filipino, a Chinese, or Maori. Now, this again shows the very Eurocentric and American-centric worldview of people in Russia. And since I watch Russian TV almost every day, even here, and I used to do that when I was in Moscow, I can tell you my experience, my observation is that almost more than 90% of the news, whether it's politics, economics, social, just focus on Europe and US. Seldom do I hear anything about China, but China now more, excuse me, but the rest of Asia is like, if there's a disaster, maybe if not. So, this is a major factor for the Russian inability to focus more on Asia, especially ASEAN. Secondly, economic necessity. Now, we all know that Russia and China are good friends now. The annual trade last year amounted to over 100 billion. But the European Union is still a major factor in Russian economic decision making, and also I think to their need or to their wish to maintain strategic independence. In other words, they do not want to become too dependent on China. Last year, their trade amounted, European Union Russia trade amounted to $174 billion. That's also not chicken feed, considering the fact that there have been 7 years of sanctions on Russia. Now, underlying all this is, I think, also a fear. I don't think I've read anything which has been publicized so far. Maybe I've missed something, but from what I know, it hasn't. But there is a fear, I believe, in Russia now that the country may become what they call raw materials and energy appendage of China. Now, this refrain I heard so often when I was there in the 90s, the mid-90s, late 90s, even until the early 2000s, that Russia will become a raw materials and energy appendage of the West. I heard that so often that to be frank, at one point I thought the Russians were being quite paranoid. I think now they do feel that about China, but like I said, I have not read anything about being said openly about this. Thirdly, because Russia's relations with the West, and again because of their Eurocentric, US-centric foreign policy and generally worldview, and especially since the last 7 years of bad relations, the Russian policymakers have no choice but to focus everything, or most of their resources, on managing relationship with the West. Now, it is obvious that Russia cannot and will not want to burn its bridges. I mean, they would be foolish to do that. Despite all their hardline talk, they do not want to do that. And this is made clear recently when the Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, he made a speech to some conference in early May in Moscow, and I quote, he said, "We are ready to be friends with the West. However," he added, "only if it comes with a sense of our own dignity." Of course, he meant there that, the West has been treating Russia badly, so we can still be friends with you, provided you treat us in a better way. Another argument I will bring forward here to make my point that Russia is not that active in ASEAN and generally the Asia-Pacific other than China, is that if you look at the trade figures again, as I already told you at the beginning, 2019, the latest figures that I have, $18.2 billion Russia-ASEAN trade. Now, you compare that with China. I've had the latest figures, 2020 figures. ASEAN and China, 2020 trade flows, trade volume, 684 billion. Now, Russia's 18 billion is, again, a drop in the ocean. With the US, almost 300 billion. So obviously, Russia here in that sense cannot play this role because, even if they wanted to, the economic interaction is not there. I think finally, we also have to look at this argument that the Russian government has been saying all these years, that they want to develop the Russian Far East in Siberia, especially the Russian Far East mainly, which is a very large area, but very few people. And frankly, I have been there a few times during my long stay. I have seen myself, but that was quite some time ago. Now, the Russian government has been saying all these years, we must develop the Russian Far East because it is crucial to our development. That's where a lot of our territory lies, the Far East and Siberia, east of the Urals, and a lot of raw materials are there. And so we need to have the engagements of Asia-Pacific countries, China, Japan, Korea, and even ASEAN countries, India, etc. Now, I know for a fact there are some investments there, but I am not very sure. To be frank with you, I have not been able to get reliable figures of how much investments have come from the Asian countries, but apparently it's not that much. In fact, most of the investments in the Russian Far East have come from the Russian government itself. So that part of Russia has seen a lot of depopulation since the fall of the Soviet Union. In fact, right now it has about 6 million people in an area, I think, almost as large as the US. Can you imagine that? And it borders China. So I really, this argument to me, it is not that, how can I say, the Russian government saying that, yes, we have to develop, and if they mean that, but whether they can get all the Asian investors there in amounts in amounts of money, which will make a real difference, that's another issue. And related to this point, this is my final point. Russia's pivot to the east, which was announced maybe 7-8 years ago in the wake of the deterioration of relations with the West, has been focused on China, and everybody knows that. I mean, Russians know that, you know that, I know that. So, right now they enjoy good relationship, both countries. We know the reasons why. But in my opinion, I think there's still a fear and suspicion of China. And it goes back a long time. It goes back not only to 1969 during the open military clashes, and I am old enough to remember reading that in the newspapers. It goes back even before that. I don't think the Chinese have forgotten that Russia was once, Tsarist Russia, before 1970, was part of the collective West, was part of the Western powers coalition, which humiliated China, in quotes, and carved out China. I don't think anyone can forget that. I mean, I was a student in history. I knew that. I read this, but in the early 60s. So, of course, I can remember that. I'm sure the Chinese can. Even Russians know that too. The scholars know that. I don't think, frankly, this issue will go away. Of course, they have delineated their border. But, delineation of a border is good today. We do not know in 20, 30 years' time when China will become even stronger. Moreover, culturally, religiously, ethnically, racially, Russia and China are totally different civilizations. I don't see how, frankly, they can really become that close friends. Japan and the US is a different proposition, because Japan was defeated totally by the US. If Japan had not been defeated, it would be a different world today. So, one side you get a civilization 5,000 years, and on this side, the other side, a powerful empire once, which was part of the coalition, like I said, which carved out China. So I don't think it is an easy proposition for these two countries. So having said that, they are, of course, trying, and they are doing a good job, I think, both leaders, of trying to put aside all this and look to the future. But having said that, I believe it is this, Russia's pivot to the east, focus on China, which is really Russia's foreign policy interest. And if I make maybe one last point, if I have the time, 2 points very fast. The Quad. We all know that the Quad is not explicitly targeted at Russia. The Russians know that, but of course they're not happy with it. And FM Foreign Minister Lavrov has actually said it is an attempt, I quote, by America, by the West, to undermine our close partnership with and privileged relations with India. That's what he said. I mean, obviously, Russia is not happy if a coalition of countries is trying to hem in China. So Russia actually is not in a very unenviable position today, trying to balance its close relationship with China with the importance of its links with India. And then you have Japan, which is another issue because they have the northern territories or the Kuril Islands problem. So they will never, the Japanese and the Russians will never really come close unless and until this issue is solved. With ASEAN, of course, we are actually neutral. We would like to see Russia in the game here, but I do not think it will be in the game because it's just there's no, like I said, there's no strong economic interaction, and without that, everything else is just how can I say, talk. Finally, this point I'd like to make, please bear with me. The Arctic in the last few years has become an arena of, I think, and it's going to become a more serious arena of great power competition in Russia and the West. And now China may come in because China is interested in exploiting the resources there. So I think, and Russia has said, the Arctic is our territory, we are responsible for it. They have built up their military resources. The West is not happy, NATO is not happy. That's another issue. But the point I'm making is that I think the Arctic will become a very important area of conflict or contention, because we know that it holds a lot of mineral wealth there. And the Russians, of course, feel that they belong, that well belongs to them. Having said that, Russia's energies therefore will have to be focused not only on the managing relations with the West, but also in the Arctic. And that will leave very little time for Russia to think about Asia, especially ASEAN. Thank you for telling me. I think I've gone over my time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Christopher, for such a very interesting presentation, building upon your own personal experiences, as well as crystal gazing a future through a historical lens. So that was really very informative, and particularly this dichotomy between Russia's identity as a European country, and it's in a sense it's the opportunity which lies in the East as that identity starts clashing with political interests from the same quarters, in a sense. So that's a very, very interesting dynamics, and a lot will depend upon how that unfolds, in a sense. So thank you so much. Next, I'm going to invite Alexei Zakharov to kind of talk about Russia's involvement with South Asia and how it kind of informs its Indo-Pacific strategy. But before I do that, I just also wanted to kind of tell our audience that they can post their questions on the chat box, and Claudia will take them up and pass it on to me, which I would then put to the panelists. So Alexei, the floor is all yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Yogesh. I'm grateful to ISAS for invitation to speak here. It's a privilege to speak at this seminar. And the topic is very interesting, Russia and the Indo-Pacific. Just moving on from what Professor Cheang has said, the Russian elite continues to be very much Europe-centric and US-centric, but due to the clash with the West, it's forced to change its mind and try to elaborate its policies in Asia. It's most vivid since 2014, even though some trends began even earlier. What began in 2014 was the attempt to conceptualize Russian policy in Asia. And we know about pivot to the east or pivot to Asia from the Russian part. There was also another concept of greater Eurasian partnership, which Vladimir Putin came up with in 2016. But then after Donald Trump administration proposed its Indo-Pacific strategy, of course, Russia was forced to react to the emergence of the network of bilateral, trilateral, and different multilateral formats in this region, which emerged in the recent years. And mainly Russian position has been, I would say, reactive and passive, because Russia continues to criticize the idea, criticize this concept. It deliberately views it through the US prism. Otherwise, I can't understand why it's happening. Because if we listen to our foreign minister and defense minister remarks to Indo-Pacific, I think that they don't take into account different visions of the region that exist in other countries, and different versions, nuances of these visions from other countries, which outline their visions of the Indo-Pacific. I think that we can even very, very soon we can publish a book with the quotes of our officials regarding the Indo-Pacific, even though many of these points are similar. They continue to criticize it as an artificially imposed construct and as an attempt to involve India in any kind of military, political, and naval cooperation. So these are generally two main ideas. To my mind, actually, unfortunately, maybe for Russian regional partners such as India and ASEAN, there are no prerequisites for changes in Russian official stance towards the region, because the same people in the same political system continue to make the same statements. And the Russian political system continues to be quite rigid. It's Russian foreign policy is driven by its confrontation with the United States. I would even say that, I mean, it's US-centric mostly. Europe is important as an economic partner. There are many economic and people-to-people ties with Europe, including people who are in the ruling elite of Russia. But from a strategic point of view, it's driven by the confrontation with the United States. And even if we see some kind of a thaw in this relationship after the Biden-Putin summit, I don't think that there will be sufficient cooperation and sufficient understanding at the bilateral level between these two countries. That's why there are no prerequisites at all for Russian changes with regard to the Indo-Pacific. Also, I mean, American strategic documents add fuel to the fire, because in different reports by the State Department and Defense Department, US Defense Department, Russia is labeled as a malign actor, and I mean, these documents make sense for Russia's coercion. Of course, to the large extent, it's by extension. So because it's China and Russia who supports China. But I think that it in a way undermines Russia's global position as as Professor Cheang said, an appendage to China, just as a huge junior brother to China, and it's unpleasant for Moscow. Now coming more specifically to South Asia, I think that we should focus on what it means for India and for India-Russia relations, of course. Well, these remarks, they are intended, I mean, these are signals for the United States, mostly. But of course, they are seen insensitive in India, because in the latest remarks by Sergei Lavrov, he mentioned that like India is being involved in anti-China games, and these remarks were said just at the moment of the border clashes with China. So I think that it was not very smart in terms of public diplomacy, as Russia being attracting a negative image in India with these kind of remarks. So instead of understanding and trying to accommodate its interests and its view of the region with India, it's trying to juxtapose itself with the Indo-Pacific region, including the vision of its partner. In 2019, Narendra Modi actually tried to connect Indo-Pacific and Eurasia, trying to navigate between these two geopolitical constructs. And it was a very good idea. I think that the Indian attempt to cooperate with Russia in the Russian Far East is a good attempt to marry these two geopolitical concepts. We see the interest from the Indian companies to cooperate in the Far East, to invest there. We see the attempt to breach this region with India through the maritime corridor, Vladivostok-Chennai. There should be more, of course, more potential for trade between the two countries, because we have to identify items we will have for our bilateral trade, even when we have sufficient connectivity. And also an interesting point is the prospect for trilateral cooperation with Japan. I know that it has been discussed between politicians as well, but for the moment it gained momentum only at the track 2 level. Probably it's a good start just to identify divergences, to identify convergences, and just to try to identify what will be avenues for trilateral cooperation. Most obviously, probably it's all about economy. Japan is an active player in the Russian Far East as an economic player. And I mean, for Russia, it's difficult to build sufficient trust with Japan, because Japan is perceived as an ally of the United States. That's why when it comes to strategic issues, military issues, it's very difficult to make move forwards on these tracks. But from the economic point of view, I think that this trilateral cooperation could be beneficial for all participants. But we should, when we speak about Russian South Asian policy, of course, we should now take into account other countries as well, and I mean Pakistan here. Pakistan does not figure prominently in the Pacific visions outlined by numerous actors, but it's still a country of the region which has its Indian Ocean coastline, and I think that Russia has made some steps to increase cooperation with Pakistan. There are several major reasons for this. Of course, it's mostly connected with the Afghan settlement, as Russian officials mentioned that Pakistan is the key regional player, and it's also an influential player, which has influence over Taliban. That's why it's impossible to bypass Pakistan when it comes to regional issues. Secondly, it's pursuing some economic interest there. The Russian companies participate in the energy project in the Karachi-Lahore pipeline. Most recently, it's been renamed as Pakistani Stream, a very interesting choice for the name, given that previous streams, pipelines by Russia were sanctioned, and I mean, they were facing many troubles on this track. And actually, this pipeline, the agreement was signed in 2015, and it was also problematic because of sanctions, because the Russian company Rostec was in the American blacklist. But now, after the change of the name, they will change also the company and probably will try to move forward. But still, it's very interesting. And of course, I think that partially it's a signal to India as well, because otherwise I can't figure out why Russia needs to strengthen Pakistani anti-terror potential. I think that, to be honest, I mean, Russian experts of weaponry will not boost up Pakistani anti-terror potential. I don't know what Russia should export there to solve the problem of terrorism. But probably there is some interest of limited cooperation on this track. And of course, it's a very, unpleasant fact for Russia-India relationship. And it shows that Russia is kind of testing ground with Indian sensitivities. It's a policy of deliberate insensitivity toward India. So all of this, I'm coming up to conclusion. All of this shows us that Russia, if we try to kind of outline its Indo-Pacific vision, it's the country without strategy, but with some policies. So it will continue to try to emerge as an important player in the region through numerous directions. Of course, I cover here only South Asia, but there are also interesting shifts and changes in Russian policy in other regions, sub-regions as well. But in general, I think that the general line will remain the same, that it's not accommodative with the Indo-Pacific visions and with so-called Indo-Pacific strategies, but we'll try to approach the region from other perspectives. Thank you for the attention.
Thanks, Alexei, for that very comprehensive, viewpoint on Russia's engagement in the Indo-Pacific, particularly with a focus on South Asia and the emerging, tensions in old alignments and the potential of new alignments in a sense, and what purpose do they serve in Russian foreign policy. But I would come to go to Nivedita, but with one comment, which is about this artificial construction of geographies. All geographies are artificially constructed because they don't depend upon topologies, but power and interests. Whether it is transatlantic, Eurasia, Asia Pacific, or Indo-Pacific. So, I think it basically reflects which geographies you accept and which you don't. Actually depends much more not on the nature, but nature of your power and interests. which kind of tells you a lot about where you could locate the fault lines in current international politics. Nivedita, I will now ask you to take over. Over to you.
Thank you, Yogesh. I'm very glad to be here today, and many thanks to the Institute of South Asian Studies, NUS, for this opportunity to discuss this topic. In understanding how Russia is reacting to the bigger Sino-US confrontation in the Indo-Pacific, I think we will need to have a quick look at what Moscow has been aiming for in the region itself. As Alexei already noted, Russia's pivot to the east is generally traced back to 2012, when Russia was planning to host APEC, and it was announced that Russia thinks that in order to develop its eastern territories, it needs to integrate better with East Asia. That will sort of help push economic development of this underdeveloped region. And this shift and this pivot also underlined an acknowledgement in the Russian foreign policy that the global geopolitics and geoeconomics is shifting to Asia Pacific, and Russia felt the need to react to that shift. And this was also Russia realizing that its presence in the East was insufficient as it existed at that point in time, and that Russia needed to look for other avenues to develop its engagement in the region in East Asia and also have a more diversified portfolio of ties. I'm not saying that Russia was not an important player in the region. Russia already had a strategic partnership with India and China. Both these relationships have been built over a period of several decades. So these are strong relationships. And it has ties with old partners like Vietnam in the region. But clearly, while announcing the pivot, Moscow had the broader region in mind, where its presence even then was fairly limited. And this was because Russia's overall engagement with what we are now calling the Indo-Pacific, it has not followed Russia's own principle of having a multi-vector foreign policy very successfully. Russia does, as Mr. Christopher also said, that Russia is a member of all the leading all ASEAN-led regional organizations. It also has an important stake in maintaining the peace and stability in Northeast Asia. Its eastern territories are directly in that region, so it's very interested there. Now there's the prospect of Arctic opening up that also makes Russia interested in the stability in the region. So all of these factors make Russia interested in this region. But I think what has happened is, while Russia's pivot to Asia began before the US-China rivalry really heated up, and before Russia's relations with the West hit a post-Cold War low, the developments over the years have highlighted for Russia the need for an enhanced partnership with the East. However, its level of engagement still remains weaker than when we compare it to the presence of other major powers. There are several other regional powers. So Russia, in that sense, is still a little behind in terms of its level of engagement, whether you look at the defense linkages in the region, in terms of trade or economic ties, or even political relationships. And Russia has been making a lot of efforts to improve its presence in the region, but all of these efforts, they are limited. They have had limited impact, and they're also fairly recent in origin. So even if they were to have an impact, it would happen like over a longer period of time. So that limits Russia's power projection capabilities at the moment in the Indo-Pacific. And amidst all of this, Russia's relations with China have grown the fastest, especially after 2014. Both the sides have realized that this relationship is very important, it's mutually beneficial, and it helps Russia deal with the impact of deteriorating relations with the West. And at this moment, the benefits that it derives from its relations with China may not be derived from any other relationship. So we cannot discount the importance of the Russia-China relationship. So in a sense, if I sum up all of what I've said, even as Russia was trying to strengthen its presence in the Indo-Pacific over the years, and its policy was still very much in the making, the regional developments seem to have outpaced its ability to transform its position in the region. And if you read the wider academic debates around Russia's pivot to the east, there's a wide acknowledgement that this pivot has only had marginal success. And I think that has to be kept in mind while we discuss Russia's response to either the Sino-US contestation or this kind of strategic choices that it is making in the region. Because these factors together have informed Russia's opposition to the development of the Indo-Pacific or the progress of the Quad. And as Alexei said, US labeling Russia a malign actor certainly has not helped matters. So Russia has objected to Indo-Pacific on the grounds that it encourages bloc politics, it is aimed at containment of China, and it undermines ASEAN centrality. So why does this worry Russia so much? So Russia believes that the establishment of a bipolar world would hurt its interests because it will not be one of the two major powers and it will be forced to take sides that might not always serve its national interests. And it believes that a polycentric world is more conducive to the promotion of its ambitions. And also Russia believes that Indo-Pacific is not just an idea for containment of China, but also by extension of Russia. So what Russia is doing is broadly framing the struggle in the Indo-Pacific in terms of the contest between the two major powers, the United States and China. And while that is clearly one aspect of the ongoing developments, it is not the only aspect that is guiding the regional developments. If you look at from the perspective of the countries of the region. But what we hear much less in Russia's reaction to Indo-Pacific is the stance of the other middle powers in the region, who are also very critical stakeholders. The Russian narrative focuses a lot on how US policy of defining the Indo-Pacific and the Quad is shaping the region. But the region is being shaped a lot more also by the rise of China, whose increasing assertiveness has led to a reaction from the middle powers, who are now worried about what this means for their position, what it means for the region. So the embrace of the middle powers of the Indo-Pacific, this is a reflection of their concern regarding the rise of China. And in this situation, Russia really needs to acknowledge that developments in Indo-Pacific are not just a major power issue. They are also very much a middle power issue. And the positions that these middle powers take will have a very deep impact on the future of the regional order. And Russia has to be sensitive to those concerns and sort of look beyond the United States when it's talking about the Indo-Pacific. Because what happens is, because if it ignores the worries of the regional states, several of whom they are dealing with the territorial disputes with China, they are worried about the impact of the BRI and the consequence of the changing balance of power in the region. So if Russia ignores all of this, it sort of backfires on Russian attempts to diversify its relationships in the region. I think there also needs to be an acknowledgement that the middle power strategy in Indo-Pacific is not directed against Russia. In fact, if you look at all these regional stakeholders, they are engaging not just with the United States, they are engaging with each other in various plurilateral formats, which is engagement in a very, very flexible manner. Because I think all the parties involved here understand that this is an unpredictable situation. The situation is still evolving. So they are trying to form these very flexible ties with each other so as to preserve their interests. And also, not all regional stakeholders consider containing China as a realistic goal, because a lot of these regional powers are very closely connected to China economically, and they also have that constraint operating on them. And all of this also needs to be considered by Moscow in order to have like a more broad-ranging policy in the Indo-Pacific. I completely understand that given the state of Russia's external relations, China will remain a key external partner. The relationship is mutually beneficial, and not to mention the fact that Russia and China together, they are a very formidable presence on the international scene. And I think we must also acknowledge that Russia has been trying very hard to strike a balancing act, whether it's in terms of relations with China and India. When India and China had the border clashes, Russia had a very nuanced position. It's trying to keep a neutral position in the South China Sea when it relates to China and Vietnam, both of which are very important partners. So it is not that Russia is not trying very hard to strike this balancing act, but China does remain the key pillar of Russia's Asia-Pacific strategy. So what more can Russia do? Just beyond trying to strike a balance, what Russia needs to do is, one, tone down its rhetoric on the Indo-Pacific and B, listen to the concerns of the regional partners, even if it does not want to engage with the US on this front, with other regional powers with whom Russia wants to build close ties. And these conversations need to happen. Because why do I say this is very important? Because if Russia fails to diversify its ties in the Indo-Pacific, it will be constraining its own strategic choices in a region where it is not a leading rule setter. Asia-Pacific is not, or Indo-Pacific is not the region where Russia, which is Russia's sphere of influence. It is not a region-wide power here. It has very different strengths and weaknesses in this region. So Russia clearly needs to do more and be a more active player. So to do that, it needs to diversify its presence. And the limitations that it has in the region must worry Russia as well, because the rising power of China will continue to shape this region. And at some point, Russia will have to react to not just what the US is doing in response to it, but what the other powers are doing in response to this rise of China. And that will have an impact on the Russian policy. So it needs to really work on the limitations and the constraints that it has in the region. So Russia does need desperately a diversified portfolio of ties in the region, not just because it wants to improve trade or it wants to sell more weapons, but also because it wants not to be over-dependent on China. This is a goal of the Russian foreign policy in itself. It wants a polycentric world. It wants a multi-vector foreign policy. So while it does have close partnerships with India and Vietnam, both India and Vietnam are also going very different directions with their foreign policy. And reacting to all of these dynamics very quickly is the need of the hour, because the pace of the developments in the region is so fast that Russia cannot afford to keep waiting and then, have a very, very long, it does not have a very long period of time to sort of establish itself in the region and reassure its partners that it is a reliable player in the region. Also, Russia, as I said, Russia would benefit from a better balance in its policies with China. And a good strategy to do that is not to alienate other powers in the region, whatever the ongoing differences. And incidentally, this diversification is important, not just for Russia to improve its position in the Indo-Pacific. It's also important because these developments here will not leave Eurasia untouched, or for that matter, Russia's vision of Greater Eurasia. Because Russia's vision of Greater Eurasia seeks to connect through the Eurasian Economic Union. It wants to bring in the countries of ASEAN to it. It wants to bring in countries of BRICS with it, with the countries of SCO. So this vast vision that Russia has, it will not remain unaffected by developments in the Indo-Pacific, because the kind of relationships we develop here, these relationships will be carried forward westwards. So if Russia can diversify, if it can emerge as an independent source of power, that will be welcomed in the Indo-Pacific by the countries of ASEAN, by India. So these are the powers that are interested in presence of Russia as an independent power. But if that fails, if Russia cannot do that, Russia will end up trying to seek influence in a region that is already very crowded with several powers and where its only key partner is China. So that will not be beneficial to Russian interests either. So amidst this, I think the questions of Russian capacity in the Indo-Pacific, its network of ties, and its ability to translate its ambitions into reality, we will need to very closely examine these issues. And because all of these together will determine the strategic choices that Russia makes in the region, where the pace of change is just very, very quick. So I'll stop here and discuss any issues later on in the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nivedita, putting together, the larger dynamics of Russian foreign policy, the opportunities and vulnerabilities of Russia's contemporary approach to the Indo-Pacific, and in a sense that how Russia could really pivot to increase as we keep on calling in India, it's strategic autonomy in the region, in a sense. This has been a fabulous discussion. I've learned a lot out of this conversation. But before we move into questions, I'd like generally 3 broad ideas, which I would like you to kind of hear your comments just on a briefly, in a sense. And this is to any one of you, in a sense. First of all, we didn't talk about domestic politics a lot. And it appears that domestic politics, to a large extent, kind of drives the most important relationship, which is the US-Russia relationship, and which then has implications for everyone else, whether it is India, whether it is Europe, so to say. So where do we fit Russia's approach to the Indo-Pacific in the domestic political contestation, which you see kind of driving the US-China relationship? That is number one. The second is, I think, it's very easy to paint the image of a Russia-China entente, a Eurasian alignment, so to say, because it's easy. It's in a sense that you can play the rise of or authoritarian alliances emerging, very liberal lens in that sense. But we do understand that there are significant problems. Power and interest diverge. As some of you kind of talked about, in a sense, whether it is Far East, whether it is Central Asia, whether it is intellectual property, or particularly the reverse engineering of Russian military equipment. So there are significant divergences, but we don't see that often in the literature out there. So what's your view on that? And is it intellectual laziness to kind of put that liberal lens and paint Russia, China together in some sense? And lastly, I think I would like you to kind of think about how Russia becomes an important player given the contradictions within Quad, so to say. With Quad and ASEAN, for that matter. ASEAN doesn't really like Quad to emerge. And in that case, can Russia be, given their kind of, similar views about ASEAN centrality, so to say, can Russia be an important player which ASEAN could use? Can Russia use the internal dissension within Quad, particularly its relationship with India, to kind of reorient Quad or kind of create internal dissensions in Quad? So I think the agency, the relationships which Russia has, plus the contradictions within these emerging geopolitical alignments, I think there is that agency which Russia could use, and maybe briefly we can reflect on that. So I'll just start with Mr. Christopher Cheang. Your just brief comments on any.
Well, frankly, I'm a very skeptical person when it comes to Russia as an actor, as a formidable actor, as an actor to be reckoned with in the ASEAN region. And I've already given the reasons why I think so. Perhaps another reason would be, the ASEAN countries, have had a long tradition of relations with the US and of course with China. China, of course, is this cultural relationship, historical relationship, and geography too. And as we know, as I pointed out, the trade links, the economic links, cultural links, they are so strong. So I don't think, even if Russia wanted to, in an ideal world, in my opinion, it'd be nice if all the major powers were present in this region, balancing each other. I'm an advocate of a balance of power. Maybe I'm from the old school, but I don't think Russia can play that role. It'd be nice. And one reason is, I don't think the Americans, or maybe in fact even the Chinese, I don't think the Chinese would take kindly if the Russians were to become really active here. Of course, I'm not saying Russia isn't independent. Russia can do what it wants, of course. But if the Chinese were to give signals and take action, I'm sure the Russians will have to take those signals seriously. So in other words, ASEAN's relationship with the US and with China and with the other partners are also, of course, important. But with these two major powers here, which are competing, ASEAN has to manage relationship with these two major powers, and Russia cannot, or for these reasons, come in. And I don't think the Russians also want to. I don't think, as Nivedita pointed out, and we all know, China looms very large in Russia's foreign policy calculations. I mean, frankly, they don't have a choice, do they? The West doesn't want them. The US, as Alexei pointed out, calls them a malign actor. So whom else can you speak to? I mean, big countries. And my experience working in Moscow is that although Russia, like all countries, say we all have sovereign equality, we all are equal in the terms of relationship, but in the end, Russia looks at big countries. Russia looks at big countries. The bigger you are, not only in size, I mean your economy, your military, the more they will listen to you. So in that sense, Russia doesn't have a choice now that they cannot. I mean, the West has, and they have a very difficult relationship. So China is the only guy they can go to. So having said that, I don't see how they can do without China's views. So to make a long story short, I don't see Russia becoming an actor, a real actor in the ASEAN region for all these reasons.
Alexei?
Thank you, Yogesh. With regard to domestic policy, I think that there is no possible deviation in Russian domestic discourse from the point that the United States is a strategic threat, that it's the country responsible for all malign activities in the world. Because even if any political party or political figure in Russia will start to change this world vision, he or she is doomed to be sidelined, to put it mildly, politically. So it's very difficult to build your political narrative, domestic political narrative, on other bases. And here it's interesting that that recently Sergei Lavrov repeated Chinese talking points with regard to Quad as a nation NATO, and it also strikes a very good chord with Russian domestic narrative, because NATO is seen as the threat coming from the Western Russian border, that it's a threat that to Eastern Europe. And here we see that it's kind of a common vision with China that now an emergence of NATO is possible for the Russian matter of vision in the Pacific. So maybe it's an attempt for the domestic audience, for Russian politicians to present it for domestic audience as a threat now from another flank of Russian border. So here it's very difficult, to change this worldview, because politically it's all about US, and it's difficult to change this narrative. And I think it also prevents Russia from moving on from its vision of the Indo-Pacific.
Thanks, Alexei. Nivedita, brief comments from your side.
Yeah, thanks, Yogesh. On your question of the Russia-China entente, I think what is important here is that both these countries, they are very pragmatic powers, right? They see at this moment in time the value of their partnership, and this is not a partnership that has qualitatively improved after 2014, yes, but the relationship has been built over a very long period. So I don't want to go into long history, but at least since the period of Gorbachev, when he started this process of rapprochement, we have seen a steady build-up. So 92, we see the military technical cooperation agreement. 96, we see both the sides sign the strategic partnership agreement and a joint declaration on a multipolar world. In 2001, they signed the Treaty of Friendship. And if you actually track the close engagement between Russia and China, they engage at every step, like every department, whether it's the foreign ministry, defense ministry, the economic departments, in every sector, they've got close linkages. So this is a relationship that has been built very carefully. But even then, but given, I said both of these countries are very pragmatic powers, they are still not willing to make this an alliance, because there's an acknowledgement that an alliance will hurt both the countries more than they would benefit. Both these countries, they're working very closely with each other. They're helping each other advance their interests without the additional tensions that an alliance might bring, sort of having to respond in case of a conflict. But if you read the Russian scholarship, the Russian scholars do point out that just the very idea that Russia and China are so close together, it sort of helps them in their dealing with the United States. So this relationship remains very important, which I don't think they are trying to build an alliance at this moment. There's also the point of US driving Russia and China sort of closer together in a lot of ways. So at this moment, they do see the benefit of remaining together. I don't want to predict in the long term because, international politics, it keeps changing. But at present, this relationship sort of seems set to sort of endure for the moment.
Thank you. I think
my microphone. Mic.
Hi, thanks. The Swedish ambassador to Singapore has put a very interesting question, I think, rightly so.
And soon you'll be able to purchase DIY tests over the counter at pharmacies.
Is it a disturbance?
And not so uncomfortable. You can administer these on your own.
Hello?
If you're worried that you may have COVID-19 and want to put your mind at ease.
Somebody's mic is on, I guess. But in any case, I think, please mute yourself if you're not speaking. So the Swedish ambassador has asked a question, and I'm going to kind of, it's on the chat box. And he basically says that I've been surprised how little discussion there has been in the region on Russia's aggression against Ukraine and its illegal annexation of Crimea, given also how disastrous it would be for this region if another strong actor behaved in such a way here. Then my question is perhaps a bit provocative. In the flyer for the 7th states that for the first time in its history, Russia is truly becoming a nation power. But other than an increased self-imposed Russian dependence on China, doesn't this discussion confirm that it is not? Russia not truly invested in the East, is not one of the top trading partners or investors of really any country in the region, not really a leading military player in the region, has no treaty ally, and few close partners ahead. Even for India and Vietnam, despite the arms trade, Russia is not even a top 15 trade partner, which kind of confirms to some of the things which Chris basically mentioned on. But I want to take upon this larger question of gray zone tactics, which I think is very, which I think is very, very apt, because we saw in some sense, in recently when China was breaking around the Taiwanese through kind of penetrating their defenses, we also saw the Russian buildup on Ukraine. And you see this rise of gray zone tactics, and it is not as if this gray zone tactics has not been used in Asia. But how does that, kind of then implicate both Russia and China in kind of using, their power vis-a-vis their immediate neighbors in a sense? So how do we kind of locate, the use of gray zone tactics, which the states are pursuing, particularly powerful states are pursuing both in Europe, so to some extent, but also in vis-a-vis South China Sea as well as the Himalayas. Nivedita, can we start from you?
Sure, Yogesh. The question of the Crimean annexation and why this is not really discussed and what does this mean for the territorial disputes in the region? So as far as India is concerned, we have a very stated policy of not commenting on domestic affairs in Russia. So I think we have just followed that policy. Even with regard to China, both Russia and China, they never comment on each other's internal affairs. That is the sort of understanding, because both Russia and China actually criticize the West for this very thing, that the West is constantly commenting or interfering in the domestic affairs of other countries. So neither will they openly come out in support of, neither will China openly come out and support Russia's annexation of Crimea, but neither will it stand there and actively oppose it. And actually in the region, it's not just China, if you say, which has not criticized Russia. When the United States imposed sanctions, South Korea, which is a US ally, did not impose those sanctions on Russia or the annexation of Crimea. Japan implemented very carefully some limited sanctions. So all the countries, they're looking at their respective relations with Russia and acting in that way, because I think there's also an acknowledgement that, what Russia is doing in Crimea is not actively impacting the bilateral relationships in any sense. So I think that is the mindset. And what does it mean, say, for the South China Sea dispute? Again, if you look at the South China Sea, Russia maintains a neutral stance on the territorial disputes, despite its close relationship with China. The only time it has openly come out in support of China, it was the case of the ruling of the Permanent Court of Arbitration, where Russia said that, but that was a very nuanced position that Russia took. President Putin said that this is a legal position we are taking, that in any arbitration, both the parties must approach the court. And since China did not approach the Permanent Court, we are not supporting this ruling. But in this explanation, there was no active support given to China on its activities in the broader South China Sea. In fact, Russia actually works with Vietnam within the disputed 9-dash line through Rosneft on oil drilling operations. So Russia does have a pretty nuanced position. It wants to stay neutral because, both its Vietnam and China, both its very important partners. So it's not an easy balancing act for Russia, so to speak. And it is trying its best to sort of not ruffle any feathers. And if in the future, if chance arises, it can act as a facilitator in case of a conflict. That might be the case, but as of now, it's staying neutral.
Alexei, I'm gonna put you on the hot seat now.
Yeah, if I can move on from what Nivedita mentioned, actually, a very nuanced stance by Russia on the South China Sea, because Russian companies, Rosneft and Gazprom, continue to conduct its projects in Vietnam and more specifically in the disputed area in South China Sea. Yes, there are some issues for Rosneft, and I think that in the recent weeks it's tried to sell its stake to another firm, again connected with this company. So, I mean, in a way, it's a kind of a very tricky situation when Rosneft has to take into account its interests in Chinese market. But still, it's the sign that Russia does not fully support China on the South China Sea issue. And the same may apply to Chinese stance on Russia's activity in Ukraine and Crimea. There are Chinese companies, in Chinese state, even though it's not supportive of US sanctions, but Chinese banks have to comply with these sanctions. And they actually, the Russian companies face troubles with the Chinese financial systems due to these sanctions by the United States on Russia following the Ukraine crisis. That's why, it's again, what you mentioned earlier, it's a sign that we can't speak about the China-Russia alliance per se, or this entente will face difficult tests when it comes to different crises. And when it comes again for the Arctic, for example, there are also divergences in views between China and Russia, as China is willing to, gain its presence and believes that Arctic is the common good, which I think Russia does not agree fully. That's why, it's again an indication that it's not all white and black between Russia and China.
Mr. Christopher. You're muted, sir. You're muted. You have to unmute yourself. Yes.
Oh, yes. Sorry. I'd just like to join Alexei Zakharov's comments. Join him in the sense that I agree what he's just said, and to add that you know, this Russia-China close relationship, there's more than it meets the eye. I'm not saying they're not real good friends, but because, as I said at the beginning, I'm a skeptic. They are good friends, but it's only because they have to be good friends with each other. And coming to the question of the Swedish ambassador, I'm looking at the question, is more a comment, but I get the impression he's puzzled why in this part of the world, Asian countries, or rather maybe we academics have had little discussion about the annexation of Ukraine and all that. If he's still here, let me just say, at least from the point of Singapore, I believe Singapore did criticize the annexation of the Crimea. I believe so, and that was 7-8 years ago. But why there isn't many discussions? Let's put it this way. I mean, the way I see it as a former diplomat of Singapore, and member of ASEAN, Singapore is a member of ASEAN. We all have our problems. A, B, we can make comments and criticize Russia on this or that. Again, with respect to Crimea and the eastern Ukraine, but frankly, what we say will have very little impact on them. I mean, we're just not going to criticize for the sake of criticism. I mean, that's the way I think anyway. I criticize you, and then it goes in here and it comes out there. What's the point? Whereas the West, Europe, the US, when they criticize and when they take action, the Russians will listen. They may not like what they hear, but they will listen. So let's face it, we have to be practical. And finally, we in Asia, like I said at the beginning, early on, in an ideal world, we want to be friends with everybody. We want to do business with Russia, with China, with the US, everybody, with the Europeans. Now they have all these big problems, the big countries. It's very unfortunate. So we try to steer, a course where, we can do business with each other without upsetting one or the other. It's not easy. But like I said, our voice, if we keep on mentioning the fact that Russia illegally annexed Crimea all the time when we meet them, like I said, will they really bother with us? They may bother to listen to China, yes, if China says, but Singapore, ASEAN, I doubt they will bother. So in the end, what's the point? What's the point of criticizing for criticism's sake? I hope I've answered the Swedish ambassador's question. Thank you.
Just to add to that, I think there are two other points there. Whether China's engagement is restricted to Russia matters because that is the fundamental point of balance of power politics. That in tandem matters for balance of power rather than Russia's engagement with all other of Indo-Pacific, so to say. So therefore, that attracts so much of attention. The second thing I also want to underline that there is a difference in perceptions of threats and what is right and wrong, whether it is in Europe and Asia. I think we kind of focus on immediate threats, and that kind of leads to a dissonance of in our perceptions of how we see Russia and China, depending upon where you sit, actually. Moving.
Yogesh,
We can't hear you.
I'm just going to group together a bunch of questions as we don't have a lot of time. So the first question is to Dr. Zakharov from Mr. Ang, civil servant at the Singapore Civil Service. What are Russia's views towards UNCLOS within the IOR, including the Malacca Straits, in the light of the increased Chinese presence there and the Russian Pacific Fleet's regular deployment in that region? The second question is by Pushkar Raj, was also, I think, either to Nivedita or Alexei, where he's basically asking, given the convergent interests of middle powers like India, Russia, is a 21st century NAM-like grouping on the cards in the name of strategic autonomy in the coming years, or the middle powers continue to be solo players converging only on selective issues? There's another question from Zavaria Kulthum Atif regarding Russia's position on Afghanistan. And I think either one of you, Nivedita or Alexei, can take that. There are a series of questions. I just want to kind of scroll my chat box really quickly. Gerg has a question as well to Nivedita. Considering the Quad formation Indo-Pacific, how do you see Russia responding? And lastly, a bunch of questions from Kuntavi, I guess, which came at the very start. So what are the chances of tensions relaxing in the region? I don't know what region she's referring to, in the Indo-Pacific, I guess, and Russian involvement in the region. There's also a question on Russian as a potential energy supplier, I think, which we covered in the South China Sea. So I just want you to take these questions and reflect on in your concluding comments, because that is the only way we are going to kind of take all the questions which are being shared with us. And I want to give a chance to each of these comments. So there is also a question on greater friction between India and Russia as the Quad unfolds, but I think part of it has been discussed. Kuntavi also wants to reflect more on the Eurasian alignment, and this is Nivedita for you, whether this bilateral engagement deepens, is it strictly restricted to South Asia, or can Pakistan itself find itself standing next to China, Russia, and the Indo-Pacific as well? I think there is another question from Douglas on China's re-education of the Uyghurs, and particularly the internal problems in Xinjiang, and whether this is a cause of concern for Russia. Maybe Chris could come on that. So here we are. I think we've covered most of them, and I gotta give you, so be selective in your response to these questions, but also you can comment upon anything else you feel we have left out of the discussion and your closing comments. So 2 minutes for each one of you. We'll start with Mr. Christopher. Over to you, sir.
Thanks, Yogesh. Yeah, Xinjiang. I was just looking at the map actually, and I saw that question. And yes, there is they share a border, Xinjiang and Russia, and the Altai region, very short border. I don't think, frankly, the Russians are, they are cause of concern, in the sense that they are aware that China can handle that matter. They're aware that China is concerned about what China has said all these years, I believe, the rise of extremism there. And so, they're quite confident that China can take care of the matter, and that it will not become like, say, when the US finally leaves Afghanistan, people are concerned that the Taliban will come back, and maybe Taliban and ISIS will infiltrate Central Asia again. I don't think the Russians believe the Chinese will allow that. So the short answer, the Russians are not concerned. They are quite confident that China can take care of the situation there. Thank you.
Thank you for keeping it very brief. Thank you so much. Alexei, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. An interesting, I will begin with the question on non-alignment movement. Actually, last year there was an initiative by Russian scholars. It was a report suggesting that Russia should consider forming a new non-alignment movement, and in this regard partner more with India as the leader of the previous non-alignment movement. But I think that this recommendation was not heard or at least we couldn't see any progress in this direction, since Russia continues to largely rely on China in its foreign policy, and as we discussed today, depend on China on many accounts. When it comes to Russian-Afghan policy, I think that now Russia established contacts with the Taliban, and Russia views that the Taliban has the chance to come back to power in Afghanistan, and Russia is better off having contacts with this, what it calls Russia movement or terrorist organization, if we follow the United Nations terms. So Russia hopes that after the Afghan settlement will have better positions, both politically and probably economically, when it has these contacts with the organization that is actually controlling most of the territory. When it comes to Uyghurs, it's difficult to say. I'm not aware of the Russian official position, but I guess that Russia will be muted on this development, because it's not common for Russia to pay attention to human rights issues, especially when it comes to foreign policy, because Russia believes that it's a political instrument to influence other countries' behavior. That's why it's usually not paying attention to human rights issues, especially when it comes to friendly nations like China. It's difficult to comment on Malacca Strait. I'm actually not aware with this development, so I will leave this question. And when it comes to Quad, I think that Russia responding by trying to invest in alternative relationships, and Russia is trying to build ties with those nations that are sidelined from the Quad and Quad Plus format, like China is most evident, Pakistan, and also Iran. And if we follow Russia's naval activity in the region, there are a growing number of naval drills with Iran, with China and Iran. There are growing port calls to Pakistan, and I think that probably it's a kind of again testing waters for Russia, but maybe it's not exactly connected with the Quad emergence. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alexei. Nivedita.
Yes, so quickly looking at the Quad formation, I think the opposition to the Indo-Pacific also flows into Russia's opposition to the Quad. Also, if you look at the individual relationships of Russia with each of the Quad members, it is only with India that it has a strategic partnership. We know the state of ties with the US. Australia is a rather minor partner. We are also aware of Russia's issues with Japan, even though a lot of efforts have been made for economic engagement with Japan. So India is actually the only country of the Quad with which Russia has a very good relationship. And I think this, the conversation that Russia has with India on issues like Quad will be very important, because India is the only non-US ally in the Quad. And a lot of its actions will sort of determine the contours of how far Quad goes, because it might not be comfortable with certain actions that US allies might be comfortable with. So Russia might want to engage deeply with India on the Quad front. And there was another question about Pakistan, Russia, China axis sort of. I don't think we have seen evidence of Russia marking such a drastic shift in its ties with India, because if that axis materializes, then the Russia-India relationship will face a lot of challenges. And I don't think we have seen any evidence of Russia not trying to keep India's interest in its mind while dealing with Pakistan. So I think I wouldn't go so far as to say that there is some kind of axis of Russia, China, Pakistan at the moment. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I've learned a lot out of this conversation, and kind of the level of interaction, the level of analysis, I think has benefited all of us. And we will go back a little bit more enriched, on Russia's role in the Indo-Pacific. I just want to end this conversation, reflecting on Indira Gandhi's Principal Secretary, P.N. Huxer, writing advising Indira Gandhi when the Soviets first gave military equipment to Pakistan in 1968. And there was a huge hullabaloo in the Indian parliament regarding reorienting Indian foreign policy towards the US. And Axel wrote to Indira Gandhi that foreign policy is a reflection of credits and debits. It's an account of credits and debits. And Russian credits are far more than there are Russian debits. And a overall account has to be taken into account when you make foreign policy decisions. I think everyone is basically looking at where are their credits and where are their debits today. And as this unfolds, as this cash register in a sense unfolds in international politics, we will see new geopolitical alignments and the strength of those geopolitical alignments, so to say. But analysts react quickly. States are a little bit more patient, so to say. But with that, I think it's an exciting time to look at various players who hold, in some sense, the future of this region. And there's no doubt that Russia plays an interesting role. Even the role of, completely, in some sense, changing the balance of power in the region. I think that's the most important factor which states in the region have to take into account when they look at Russia's import for the region. With that, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much to our panelists for providing us with their thoughts, with their time, and also to our participants world over, to have spared their very valuable time. Thank you so much, and hopefully we will continue this engagement on Russia, Indo-Pacific, South Asia, and maybe as Europe gets involved in the Indo-Pacific, this larger interaction between Russia, Europe, Indo-Pacific, and China. So there are lots of possibilities here. And with that, I would like to kind of put a stop to today's proceedings. Thank you so much. Once again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you, Nivedita. Thank you, Alexei.
До свидания. Всего доброго.